Okay, we start. So today we turn to the last topic of this course, which is the second application of reflection positivity, which is called the infrared bound. Gaussian domination and the infrared bound. So again, we will be working with measures which are reflection positive, but we will need more structure than for the chessboard estimate. So let me explain what kind of models we can deal with in this setting. So here I will assume that configurations are given by to each vertex I associate a spin which takes value in R nu. So configurations are application from the torus to R nu for some nu greater or equal 1. Then as I assume that we have an a priori measure on each of these copies of R nu, we have some measure on R nu, which, to simplify the analysis, I will assume to be supported on a compact subset of R nu. So supported on a compact subset of R nu. Then the type of Hamiltonian, and that's where the main restriction, there will be two kinds of restriction. The first that we are working in R nu instead of a general topological space. And the second one is the form of the Hamiltonian. So the Hamiltonian will be taken to have this form. So it will be H of L and beta. It will be given by beta times the sum of the all pairs of neighbors in the torus of the L2 norm of Si minus Sj. So this will always be the L2 norm. I will not indicate it usually during this course. This double bar will always be the L2 norm. So here, Si of omega is just omega I, just the spin at I. So I'm just taking the L2 norm of the difference of spins between neighbors, summed over the whole torus. Okay, so that's the kind of Hamiltonian we will consider. And then the measure, the Gibbs measure, is as usual the probability measure on the torus, which is defined as follows. So I will denote it by mu L beta, and it's defined by its density with respect to the product measure. So mu naught is, as last week, the product over all copies, all vertices of the torus of rho, which was this a priori measure attached to each vertex. Okay. So that's just a product measure. And then I look at the density of our Gibbs measure with respect to this product measure. And this has the usual form, E minus HL beta divided by partition function. Okay, so that's the setting. So the main restriction, apart from the fact that spin take value in R nu, is the particular form of the Hamiltonian, which is much more specific than what we looked at last week. Let me just show that there are some interesting models in this class. There are many actually, but I will only mention two, which we have already seen. So this class first contains all the ON models. We just take mu equal to n. We take rho, which is the uniform measure on the sphere in Rn, unit sphere. And the fact that you get the ON model it's kind of obvious because Si minus Sj square. This you can just, okay, it's Si minus Sj, scalar product Si minus Sj. You expand, you get the norm of Si, which is 1, plus the norm of Sj, which is 1, so it's 2, minus the mixed term, which is 2 Si times Sj. So this will give you some constant, which is completely irrelevant, does not depend on the configuration. And this, when you sum over all edges of the graph, it gives you exactly the Hamiltonian of the ON model. Okay, so you recover the ON model. And second class of model which falls into this framework is the Potts model, so Q-state Potts model. Okay. So here you just take nu, which is Q minus 1. You take rho, which is the uniform measure on the vertices of the regular Q simplex. So let me just draw pictures. So when nu is equal to 1, so Q is equal to 2, this is just the uniform measure on the two vertices which are at the endpoint of the unit segment. When nu is equal to 2, which means Q equal to 3, you just get an equilateral triangle. Okay? And you have rho is the uniform measure on the three vertices of this triangle. If you take nu equal to 3, which is Q equal to 4, you get the tetrahedron, so the uniform measure on the vertices of the tetrahedron, and so on and so forth. Okay? And of course, if now you look at this quantity, so the L2 norm of the difference between two spins, well, either the two spins agree, and in this case you just get that this L2 norm is equal to 0, or they disagree, and then they give you something which is independent of on which are the values of the spin, only the fact that they differ, right? So you just get two possible values for the interaction, which just gives you the Potts model. Okay, only two possible interactions. Either the spin agree or they disagree, and the energy is not the same in both cases. Okay, so these are two examples of classes of models which fall into this framework, even though there are many others, of course. Okay, so that was one thing. So the first technical tool we will need, so our goal is to get to the infrared bound, and the first thing we need is this Gaussian domination. So it's theorem 1016. Gaussian domination tells you the following. So let's consider a collection H, Hi, I in the torus, of, say, which takes value in R nu. So each of the Hi takes value in R nu. Okay? So you just fix a collection, a configuration, if you want, of the model. And then you introduce the deformed partition function, which I will denote ZL beta of H, which is defined as follows. So it's just the expected value of the exponential of minus beta sum over all ij edges of the torus. Instead of putting the L2 norm of Si minus Sj, I will deform this. I will put the L2 norm of Si minus Sj plus Hi minus Hj, like that. And then you close it, and this is the expected value with respect to the product measure mu naught. Okay. And now the claim is that this quantity, ZL beta of H, reaches its maximum for H identically 0. So this is always smaller than ZL beta of 0. Okay. That's just the special value of H where Hi equals 0 for all I. Okay. So that's the Gaussian domination. And maybe just one remark. Of course, ZL beta of 0, so the one which maximizes this class of deformed partition functions, it's just the usual one. When H is equal to 0, the deformation disappears, and what we get is just the usual partition function ZL beta. Okay. was a remark. This maybe I will skip. Okay. So now I would like to prove this theorem 1016. And to prove it, I need a lemma, which is a very simple generalization of something we did 2 weeks ago. So we let mu be some measure which is reflection positive with respect to some reflection theta. Let A, B, C alpha, D alpha be functions which have their support in the plus part, plus half of the torus with respect to theta. So in this algebra A plus of theta. Okay. Then we have the following inequality. So if you look at the expected value of exponential of A plus theta of B plus sum over alpha C alpha theta of D alpha. Take expectation value of this with respect to the measure mu square. This is smaller than, let me write it like that, EA plus theta A plus sum over alpha C alpha theta of C alpha mu times EB plus theta of B plus sum over alpha of D alpha theta of D alpha. We had something completely similar 2 weeks ago. I will just prove this version now. It's the one which is needed for the proof of theorem 1016. So proof of lemma 1019. Okay, it's pretty straightforward. So we proceed roughly as we did for the simpler version. So we have A plus theta B. And then, okay, let me write it first like that. Sum over alpha C alpha theta D alpha. So that's what we want to understand. And if you remember, we had something completely similar, but where we had C alpha theta C alpha. And now what we are going to do is that, we are going to do exactly the same we did the other time, is that we are going to expand the exponential of this term. So this gives you sum over n, 1 over n factorial, sum over alpha 1, alpha n, and then you get EA plus theta B, and then you get C alpha 1, C alpha n, theta of D alpha 1, theta of D alpha n, mu. Okay. Not done anything. And now we are going to work with this guy. Okay. So first observation is that this guy, I can write it as EA C alpha 1 C alpha n theta of EB D alpha 1 D alpha n. Okay. So I can apply the Cauchy-Schwarz inequality we had for this scalar product, F theta G, right? So this is smaller than sum over n, 1 over n factorial, sum over alpha 1 to alpha n, and then we get EA C alpha 1 C alpha n theta of EA C alpha 1 C alpha n, 1/2 times the same thing, EB D alpha 1 D alpha n, theta of EB D alpha 1 D alpha n, 1/2. Right? I just applied one of these lemma we proved, lemma 10-4, I think. This is lemma 10-4. Okay. Tells you that this is bounded by this product. Okay? So we are not yet completely done because we still have to deal with all these sums. But what I'm going to use, I'm going to use twice Cauchy-Schwarz inequality now for the relevant sums. So let's start with this sum. So I have the sum over alpha 1 alpha n of some function of alpha 1 alpha n times another function of alpha 1 alpha n. So I can apply Cauchy-Schwarz to this particular scalar product. So this is Cauchy-Schwarz. So this does not move, it's still there. But then, when I apply Cauchy-Schwarz, I will get sum over alpha 1 alpha n EA, okay, EA C alpha 1 C alpha n theta EA C alpha 1 C alpha n. Okay, all the expectation with respect to mu. This 1/2 times the same thing, alpha 1 alpha n EB D alpha 1 D alpha n theta EB D alpha 1 D alpha n 1/2. Right? So I've not just apply Cauchy-Schwarz to this sum. And now I will apply again Cauchy-Schwarz to this sum, but in order to do that, I will distribute this 1 over square root of n. I will put it as 1 over n factorial. I will put it as 1 over square root of n factorial here, and 1 over square root of n factorial here. Right? So that does not change anything. But now again, I have the sum over n, some function of n, times another function of n, so I can apply again Cauchy-Schwarz. And this will be smaller than the sum over n, 1 over n factorial, sum over alpha 1 alpha n, EA C alpha 1 C alpha n theta EA C alpha 1 C alpha n mu everything to the power 1/2 times the same thing with the A and C replaced by B and D. Alpha n EB D alpha 1 D alpha n theta EB D alpha 1 D alpha n mu 1/2. And then both of these sums you can, so I have the sum over n, 1 over n factorial, sum over alpha 1 alpha n of all these things. I can reconstruct an exponential of C, of the sum over alpha C alpha, and this gives us exactly what we want. Let me just write the result. So this is just equal to the expected value of EA plus theta A plus sum over alpha C alpha theta of C alpha 1/2 times EB plus theta B plus sum over alpha D alpha theta D alpha 1/2. Okay. Exactly what we wanted. So you just apply Cauchy-Schwarz several times, and you get this result. You will see that it will be very useful to prove lemma 10(16). So let's turn to the proof of this lemma. Okay, so we want to locate the maximizer, and we want to show that 0 is one of the maximizers of H. Okay. So let's first observe that for any H, if you so you fix some H, and then you let one of the components go to infinity, okay, of ZL beta of H. And when you do that, because of the form of the Hamiltonian here, this goes to 0. So that means that the maximum of ZL beta of H is reached at finite H. So you don't have to go to infinity to see it. When you send H to infinity, you just go to 0. So that's first observation. Second observation that I want to make, let me do it this way. So let H star, okay, let H star be some maximizer of this function ZL beta. Okay. I take one of the maximizer, and how do I choose this maximizer? I will choose it such that it minimizes some quantity. So chosen so that H star minimizes the following quantity. Among all the maximizers, it's one of the maximizers which gives the smallest value to the quantity I'm going to write, which I will call n of H. And n of H is just the total number of pairs of neighbors, Ij, at which Hi is different from Hj. So you give yourself, you take a maximizer and you count how many pairs of neighbors you have where you have different values for H on both vertices. Okay? And then you choose for H star one of the maximizers which has the smallest possible value of n of H. Okay? Now the claim is that n of H star is equal to 0. Okay? The minimal value that you can reach among all maximizers for this quantity is 0. So let me first prove that if this is true, if the claim holds, then the theorem is proved. Theorem 1016 follows. Okay, I will want first to do that, and then I will prove the claim. So I will do it here. So assume that the claim holds. Then what can you say? So we're assuming that, so if the claim holds, that means that for all pairs of neighbors, Ing, I have Hi equal Hj. So for sure, I have that H star is equal to a constant. Okay? H star is just constant. Now, if you look at the way the function H, the configuration H, enters inside the definition of ZL beta of H, here, you see that it only enters as a function of the gradient of H. You always have only Hi minus Hj over all possible pairs. So if now I replace Hi star, I put Hi star equal Hi star plus C for all I, for the same C, for all I in PD, okay, then the value of ZL beta of this new value of Hi star tilde is the same as for Hi star, because I've just added C here and removed C here, so this does not change anything. For this L2 norm here, does not see the shift by a constant. So in particular, I can assume that the constant which is here is just 0. Okay? Doesn't change anything. So without loss of generality, H star is identically 0, which is what we wanted to prove. We wanted to prove that 0 is one of the maximizers, and indeed, what this claim tells you is that the maximizer which has the smallest value of n of h has n of h equals 0, so it's a constant maximizer, so it can be taken as h star equals 0. Okay, so this would prove the theorem. So the only thing I have to prove is this claim. Okay. So proof of the claim. So it's not so difficult. That's where we are going to use this and the lemma we have proved here. I don't know with what I want to start. Okay, let's first make an observation. Okay, maybe I will do it elsewhere because I won't have enough space. Let me do it here. Start with an observation. I want to apply this lemma we have just proved. So I have to check that this quantity which is here, this quantity here in the exponent, it can be written as A plus theta B plus sum over alpha of C alpha theta D alpha. Okay, so that I can apply the lemma to it. Okay, so observation, this quantity which is in the exponent here, for minus beta, sum over all ij in E and D, Si minus Sj plus Hi minus Hj square. This I can write as follows. So let me do it properly. So I have minus beta, sum over all how do I want to? Okay, it doesn't matter. Sum over all I and j which belong to T, D, L plus of theta. So I take them both on the plus half of the torus, and I assume that I and j are neighbors. Okay, and I just put this function Si minus Sj plus Hi minus Hj square. Then I will have something of the same type here, minus beta, sum over all I and j, which now lie in the minus part of the minus half of the torus, I neighboring j, the same thing, Si minus Sj plus Hi minus Hj square. So if I've done that, I've reconstructed almost the whole sum here. The only thing which is missing is, so somewhere you have, okay, I should say what I want to do with, okay, let me say one thing. So I want to prove the claim. So I want to prove that n of h star is equal to 0. Right? So I will prove it by contradiction. So assume that n of h star is strictly positive. Right? If it's strictly positive, that means that I can always find a pair of neighbors where h star of, say, uv, so there exist uv neighbors, say ELD, such that h star of u is different from h star of v. Okay? Because I have at least one pair which disagree, so let's call uv such a pair. Okay? And then let theta be the reflection such that theta of u is v. Right? I'm just taking the hyperplane, so I have u and v somewhere, u and v, and I take the reflection theta, which through the hyperplane which goes through the edge uv. Right? Just take this particular reflection theta, and let's apply it. Let's use this theta here. That's this particular value of this particular reflection I want to use. So here I have taken everybody which appears in this sum. It also appears here, except for all the pairs of vertices which are on both sides, nearest neighbor vertices, which are on both sides of this hyperplane. Okay? So I have still to add them. And the right way to do that is as follows. So this, notice that this L2 norm here, I can write it. So I can write it as the L2 norm of Si plus Hi square plus Sj plus Hj square minus 2 times Si plus Hi, scalar product, Sj plus Hj. Right? This is the scalar product of Si plus Hi and Sj plus H. I mean, you take twice this vector, scalar product with itself, you expand the product, and you get something like that. Okay? So this allows me to rewrite the contribution which comes from vertices which are on each, neighboring vertices which are on each side of this hyperplane as follows. I will split into 3 sums. So one will be this one, so it will be minus beta, sum over all u in the plus half, t, d, l plus of theta, such that u is a special vertex, let's say I, okay, such that I is the nearest neighbor with theta of I, which is just one way of saying that I'm summing over the guys which are along the plane, okay, of this thing, so Si plus Hi squared. Now I do the same here for the minus half, so I have minus beta, sum over all I, or say j, in Td L minus of theta. So the minus part, I want j to be nearest neighbor with its reflection, Sj plus Hj squared. So I've taken this term, which I've put here and there, and I still have to take this term, so I still get plus 2 beta, sum over all Ij in the vertices, such that I is equal to theta of j. Okay. And let's say to be specific, I can take I, okay, doesn't matter. Okay. I do that, and okay, I belongs to the plus part and j to the minus part, T, d, L plus of theta, and j automatically to the minus part. And then I have the scalar product, so Si plus Hi, scalar product Sj plus Hj. Right, now I have everything. The sum over the plus half, the sum over the minus half, and these 3 guys reconstruct the sum along the hyperplane. Okay? And now observe that everything which is here, all the functions which appear here, they are functions which live on the plus half of the torus. Here I'm only summing over I and j on the plus half. Here I'm summing over I, which is in the plus half. So all of that, maybe I will change color. All of that, I can write it as some function A, right? Some function A which lives in A plus of theta. Now, all of the things which appear here, they are all, I mean, I and j are in the minus half of the torus, j is in the minus half of the torus, so all these functions which appears here, I can write it as theta of b, with b which is in the plus half of the torus. Okay? It's the reflection of something which lives in the plus half, that gives me something which lives in the minus half. And for the last part here, what you observe is that this, by construction, it lives, so I can call it C alpha, and this I can call it theta of d alpha, where C alpha and d alpha belongs to A plus of theta. And alpha is just something which indexes these edges which cross the hyperplane, right? So you see that I've been able to rewrite the exponent, which appears in the definition of this deformed partition function, as exponential of A plus theta b plus the sum over alpha C alpha theta d alpha. Okay, so exactly the form we need to apply the lemma. So let's apply the lemma. So lemma 10, what was it, 19, I think? Don't have it anymore, I think it was 1019. So this lemma 1019 implies that ZL beta of H star, say square, this is smaller than, and then I get, what do I get when I apply this lemma? So if you remember when you apply the lemma, maybe I can write it here. So if you apply the lemma, you have that the expectation value of E plus theta b plus sum over alpha C alpha theta d alpha, this guy, square, which is our ZL of H, which it has this form. This is smaller than EA plus theta A plus sum over alpha C alpha theta C alpha, right? Times, and the same thing with A and B and interchange and C alpha and D alpha interchange, right? Same expression as you have here. So what happens when you look at the terms we have here? So to what corresponds the choice e to the power a plus theta of a and C alpha theta C alpha? So I've replaced B by A and D alpha by C alpha. So what does it do to our partition function? So let's compare this A, which we have here, and the theta B, which is here. The only difference between these two expressions is that here I'm using the magnetic field HI, which are living on the plus half of the torus. Right? Here all these HI and HJ are living on the plus half of the torus. Here I'm using the magnetic field which are living on the other side of the torus. Right? This is theta of B, but when I take the reflection of this function to construct B, then this function B, it will be Si minus Sj plus H theta I minus H theta j. It's going to see the magnetic field of the other side. So that means that what you get when you apply this lemma is this inequality. This will be smaller than Z L beta of H star, say, plus Z L beta H star, let me put the plus up, plus minus. Okay, where H star plus at I, it's equal to, well, H star at I if I belongs to the plus half of the torus, and H star at theta of I if I belongs to the minus half of the torus. And for H star minus, you get exactly the same thing, but with plus and minus interchange. So if I want to make a picture, what we have is the following. I want to make a picture. So that's our torus. I have flattened the torus, but that's our torus. And then this is this reflection theta of the torus that we are considering. And then I have some H star. Okay, when I want to construct, H star is defined the whole torus. But when I want to construct H star plus, I take this half of H star that I have, and I reflect it here. Right? This will give me H star plus. And when I want to construct H star minus, what I do is that I take the H star, which is well defined here, and I reflect it here, and this gives me H star minus. Right? Here what we do. So the application of this lemma is just reflecting things, and so it's making a copy of the field that you have on the left-hand side to the right, and copy of the one you have on the right and to the left-hand side. And this defines you two new configuration of magnetic field, H star plus and H star minus. So why is it useful, this inequality we have just written? So what does it tell us? So it tells us the following. So ZL, let me rewrite it. So I've just rewrote the same thing as there. But now, remember that by assumption, H star is a maximizer of this function. So this cannot be larger than Z of H star. So this is smaller or equal Z L beta of H star. Right? But now I can divide by ZL of H star on both sides. So this implies that Z L beta of H star is smaller or equal Z L beta of H star plus. Okay? But this was a maximizer of ZL beta. For this value of the field where I've reflected 1/2 of H star to the other side of the torus, I get something which is larger or equal to what I had here. So this means that this is also a maximizer. This should be an identity, and this is a maximizer. So I have that H star plus is a maximizer of ZL beta. Right? But now, what happens when I do this? Remember that along this line, I had a particular pair of vertices, UV, where H star U and H star V were different. But after I've made the reflection, I've constructed H star plus and H star minus, everybody along this line agrees with its neighbors along this line, because it's just the reflection. Okay, and the same here. Everybody here agrees with everybody here, right? So that means that by assumption, I have that, say, the minimum of n of H star plus and n of H star minus must be strictly smaller than n of H star. You see, how many defects, how many pairs of neighbors with disagreeing values do I have here? Well, I have as many as I had in this half, okay, twice as many as I had in this half, and 0 along this line. Here I have twice as many as I had on this half and 0 on this line. So now if I choose among H star plus and H star minus the one which has the smallest number of defects in its corresponding half, so I look at the number of defects here, the number of defects here, and I take the one which is the smallest one, and when I reflect it, I construct a configuration which has strictly less defects than I had before, okay, because I've removed at least this one. Okay. So here, of course, it's completely symmetric that it's H star plus or H star minus which realizes this minimum. I'm just assuming that it's an H star plus. Okay? Without loss of generality, I assume it's this guy. Okay. Otherwise, you just apply the inequality here instead of there, and you just get inequality with a minus here. Okay? So, but this contradicts the fact that H star plus is a maximizer, contradicts the fact that H star minimizes n of n overall maximizer. Okay? Because I've just constructed a maximizer which has a smaller, strictly smaller value of n of h. Okay? So it's a contradiction. So the assumption that n of h star was strictly positive cannot hold, and we've proved the claim, and therefore we've proved the theorem. Okay? So the core of the argument is really this reflection, which allows you to homogeneize. Again, it's the same kind of idea we used last week. We are homogeneizing. Here, originally in H star, you can have something which looks very different everywhere, but now we have homogenized one half of the torus. I mean, we've just copied one half of the torus on the other side. And this can only improve the value of z, and with this you get the contradiction. Right, so that was the proof of this theorem. So it's almost 10. I suggest that we make the break now. We start again in 15 minutes, and then we prove the infrared bound and see an application. So agree, this Gaussian domination theorem that I've stated is pretty abstract. In particular, it's not obvious at all from the statement why it's called Gaussian domination. There are some explanation in the book, which you can look if you want. The point is that for us here, it's really a technical result of which the consequence, which is the infrared bound, will have more significance. And I will state the infrared bound now, and it will also appear to be a bit it will not be clear what the infrared bound is telling you also, but you will see that when we will apply the infrared bound, its meaning will be much clearer. So let me state the infrared bound. For this, I need just one notation, which is the reciprocal torus, TDL star. TDL star is the set 2 pi over L times N1 and B with all the Ni between 0 and N for all I. Okay. That's just the reciprocal torus. I need it because the infrared bound is a statement about the Fourier transform of some quantity defined on the torus, actually on the two-point function. So theorem 1021, infrared bound, which is a powerful tool. We're also going to use a version of it in Hugo's course. So it's telling you the following. Actually, it will be, the version is using is a consequence of this one, but you have to work a little bit more to get to it, but we only need this version. So for any element of the reciprocal torus, TD L star, which is different from 0, we have the following inequality. So if you look at the sum over all j in the torus of S0, Sj, we look at the two-point function, we take its Fourier transform. So E, I, P, J. I'm looking at its Fourier transform, the mode P of the Fourier transform. And this is smaller than nu. So this is the, remember, the spins are taking value in R nu. So nu is the dimension of the spin space over 4d beta. With my normalization, it's 4d beta, which comes out. And times 1 minus 1 over 2d, sum over all j neighboring 0, cosine of p times d, p scalar product j. Let's do it like that. Or minus, to the power minus 1. Okay, so that's the infrared bound. It's something which tells you, which gives you an estimate on all the mode, except the 0 mode, all the mode of the Fourier transform of the two-point function. You will see it's not clear what it's telling you exactly, but it will be much clearer later. So maybe I can motivate why it's not completely crazy to look at the Fourier transform of various quantities here. So if you remember, so our goal, maybe I should stress it, so our goal now is to prove that if you take the ON model in dimension 3 and higher, at sufficiently low temperature, there is spontaneous magnetization. The spins will align. So in dimension 2, we saw that Mermin-Wagner theorem was implying that there is no long-range order in the system. We are going to show that in dimension 3 and higher, there is long-range order for the ON model. And so we have to exclude what is happening in dimension 2, which was preventing long-range order. So what was happening in dimension 2 or 1? It was, if you remember, the fact that we could construct in the system these spin waves, which were excitations, spins excitation of very long wavelengths, which appeared in the system, and which were destroying because the energy associated to these very long wavelengths excitation was very small. They were destroying all attempt at making a long-range order in the system. They were just turning spins all around on very large length scales. So we want to show that these very long spin waves, they don't exist in dimension 3 and higher. So one way to extract these spin waves to see if they are there or not is to take the Fourier transform. The Fourier transform is telling you, do you have some periodic behavior at various length scale in your system? Okay? That's exactly the role of the Fourier transform, is to give you a decomposition in plane waves, say, and you want to check that you don't have waves of very large wavelengths in the system. And this, maybe it's not obvious from what I've written here, but that's exactly what this inequality is giving you. And it will be much clearer when I will apply it to the ON model in a few minutes, okay, after having proved this theorem. Okay, so let's prove this. Maybe I start here. So proof. So it's a consequence of this theorem 1016 of this Gaussian domination. In a sense, it's this Gaussian domination can be seen as an integral version of the infrared bound, because what we're going to do is just, okay, we look at the conclusion here, which is telling you that z at 0, at 0 we have a maximum of this function z of h. Okay, so what does it mean? It means that for any h, so theorem 1016 implies that for any h, if I look at the derivative with respect to lambda of z L beta of lambda h, so lambda is just a real number. Okay, I'm taking any configuration h. now I scale this configuration h by lambda, compute the derivative at 0. Well, at 0, I know that I have a maximum of this quantity, right? So this derivative should be equal to 0. That's what it means to be a maximum of a function. But that's just here you are just saying that you have a critical point of the function, but actually you have a maximum because if you look at the second derivative of lambda h at lambda equals 0, this should be negative. So that's exactly the statement that ZL beta has a maximum at h equals 0. Right? And now what we are going to see is that this infrared bound is a rather immediate consequence of this second inequality, this inequality here, star. Okay. So to see that, I have to write explicitly what is the second derivative. We have z, it's written here, so z is here. I have to compute two derivatives of this, so we want to compute it at lambda h. We have lambda here and lambda here. We want to compute derivative with respect to lambda twice, and that's just some algebra. I will not do it on the blackboard. Otherwise, I will make mistakes. I will just give you the answer. So if you make the computation, you get that the second derivative of ZL beta at lambda h when lambda is equal to 0, this is equal to, maybe like that. There are two terms. The first one is 4 beta square, expected value of sum over all ij, ELD, Si minus Sj, scalar product Hi minus Hj. So I'm summing over all pairs of neighbors the scalar product of Si minus Sj, Hi minus Hj. You take the modulus of this number, square, take okay, like that, and then you still have E minus the Hamiltonian, minus Hn, under the product measure mu naught. That's the first term, and the second term is minus 2 beta, E minus Hn under mu naught times the sum over all ij in ELD of Hi minus Hj square. It's just a computation. It's really not a difficult computation, but on the blackboard, I'm too likely to make a mistake, and then it will just confuse things. Okay. So that's what you get if you compute two derivatives, and you take lambda equals 0. So now I want to use star. So star is telling me that the quantity I've just computed here is non-positive. It's negative of 0. So star can be rewritten as follows. So let me rewrite it. So yes, I will write it in this way. So sum over all ij ELD Si minus Sj Hi minus Hj. So you see that when I take, okay, when I want to write the inequality, so I will take this guy on the other side, but then I can, this quantity here, maybe I should say it here, this quantity here is just ZL beta, right? Just the partition function. So if I divide by this quantity, I divide both terms by this quantity, I will get this divided by the partition function. It just gives me the expected value of this sum under the Gibbs measure, right? This sum square under the Gibbs measure. So I get this square, but now under the measure L beta. Okay? I just have V minus H, and I divide by the partition function. So this constructs me the density of the Gibbs measure with respect to the product measure. Right? So this is one of this is the left-hand side, and the right-hand side will be given by, so I have 4 beta square. When I divide, I should get 1 over 2 beta, sum over ij in ELD, Hi minus Hj square. Okay? Let me check that the constants are fine, but I think it's correct. It looks correct. So let's call this version star star. That's the one I want. And now I claim that this is just a rewriting of that. So that for a suitable choice of H. So this now I can erase. I have to choose H in a proper way. So let me make a comment. So star star holds for any h which is in R nu to the power of the torus, TDN, right? But that implies that star star holds for any h which is in C nu to the torus. Why? Because if you look at the inequality which is here, so this is real. So this might be complex if now I take h complex valued. So the modulus, I can write this as the real part plus the imaginary part of this number. And when I take the modulus square, I just get the absolute value square of the real part and then plus the absolute value square of the imaginary part. They split, right? And then on the other side, you have the same splitting, which here, you have same splitting which happens. So you can apply this inequality star star to the real part and then to the imaginary part, and you sub both. You get the inequality for h in C nu. Okay, so that's what I will do, and I will now work as follows. So let's fix, say, L, which is in 1D, just one of the lattice directions. Let's set alpha j. This will be E, I, how do I want to write it? P, J, for some P. Okay, let me fix this and fix P in the TV star L minus 0, okay, one of the relevant P's. Okay. And I set alpha j is EIPJ, just the plane wave of wave number P. And then we choose H. So that's for all J in the torus, of course. Now I choose Hj is equal to alpha j EL, where alpha j is this number I've just defined, and EL is just the else unit vector in the canonical basis of R nu. Okay. So E1, D should be nu. This should be nu. E nu is the canonical basis in R nu. So I'm choosing all the H, which are vectorial quantity. I choose them all in the same direction, so they are basically scalar now. And the scalar I choose is EIPJ at J. Okay. And now I will rewrite this for this particular choice of H. So I have to see what the right-hand side is and what the left-hand side is. And I claim that once you do that, you find this inequality. So let's see. Let's start with the right-hand side. So let's forget about the constant. For a moment, I'm just working with the sum. So I have the sum overall ij in ELD, hi minus hj square. But this I can write as, okay, since hi and hj are both along the direction EL, I get the norm of EL square, which is just 1. Okay, so I will just get sum overall ij in ELD, and I will get a gradient of alpha ij, say gradient of alpha bar ij, gradient of alpha ij. Right, this is gradient of h square. But gradient of h times the norm of EL square, which is 1. So I get gradient of alpha times gradient of alpha bar, because these are complex valued now. Alpha is EIPJ. So when you define the norm, you have to take the correct scalar product where you take the complex conjugate of one of the two terms, the two factors. Right? So that's what I get. So that's just complex conjugate of alpha. Complex conjugate of alpha. Okay, now we have something which is sum of gradient alpha bar, gradient alpha. We want to use our discrete green identities, which we proved so long ago. You just have to check that the proof we gave of the discrete green identity works in these settings on the torus. And it does work on the torus. The thing is that since you're on the torus, there are no boundary conditions, so you don't get a boundary term. So it's simpler. So you just get minus sum overall I in the torus, say alpha bar I, Laplacian alpha I. Let me put the minus here. minus Laplacian alpha I. And there are no boundary terms because you're on the torus. Just check that this works. Okay? So now if I want to go on, I have to compute the Laplacian of alpha. Or minus the Laplacian of alpha. Minus Laplacian of alpha at I. This, by definition, is the sum over all j neighboring I. So the Laplacian would be alpha j minus alpha I, but I have minus the Laplacian, so it's alpha I minus alpha j. Okay. Now I substitute, so it's sum over j neighboring I, E I p scalar product I minus E I p scalar product j, okay, which is just, I can take this factor out, so it's E I p scalar product I, sum over j neighboring I, 1 minus E I p scalar product j minus I. Okay. Now what happens when I do this sum? So the sum over 1, sum of j neighboring 1 of I of 1, it just gives me 2d. So let me take 2d out. So 2d E I p scalar product I, and then I get 1 minus, and I've taken 2d out, so I have 1 over 2d, sum over, and what can I say about this? This sum over j neighboring I of a quantity which only depends on j minus I, so it's the same as j neighboring 0 of the corresponding quantity, so j neighboring 0, E I p j, right? Not that much. And now you just write EIPJ as cos pj plus I sine pj, and you observe that the sign changes sign when you take j and minus j, and they cancel. So the imaginary part, when you take the contribution of the neighbor j and the neighbor minus j, they just cancel each other. So the only thing that remains is 2d E I 1 minus 1 over 2d, sum over j neighboring 0, cosine of pj, p scalar pj. Okay, so that's computation for minus Laplacian of alpha, which I can now insert here. And what I get, if I insert this expression, is 2d. So the EIPI that I have here, it will cancel with the E minus IPI that I get for alpha I bar. It gives me 1. And then what remains is only 1 minus 1 over 2d, sum over j neighboring 0, cosine of p scalar j. Okay, so that's the right-hand side written for this particular choice of h. And now we have to do the same for the left-hand side. So it's here, so I will not erase this one. Okay, so left-hand side, exactly the same kind of things. So let's work out the left-hand side. I will first work out the sum here before taking the modulus square and the expected value. So sum over ij of Si. Let me write it immediately like that. So this, okay, let me do it slowly. So Si minus Sj, scalar product Hi minus Hj. Okay. So this is what? Probably I have enough space here. This will be sum over ij. And now Hi and Hj, they are both vectors which are along the direction L, okay, multiple of EL. So what I get when I multiply take the scalar product with this, I just get the S component of Si minus Sj. So the S component, I will denote it Si L minus Sj L. And then I have alpha I minus alpha j. Okay. Well, okay, let me write it. So I've set S I L, by definition, is just S I times EL, scalar product EL. Okay, nothing deep here. Okay. So again, I have something which is of the form sum over ij, gradient S L ij, gradient alpha ij. Right, so again, I can apply this discrete gradient identity. So this will be sum over I in the torus, SIL minus Laplacian alpha I, and you substitute. What is minus Laplacian alpha? We have it here. It's 2D. E times I, sum over j neighboring I. No, it's 1 minus 1 over 2D, sum over j neighboring 0, cos pj. Okay, something like that. Should be correct. So let me just put the constant outside the sum. So I get 2D, this 1 minus 1 over 2D is the sum. And then I get the sum over I, SIL, EI, P times I. Okay. Good. So that's for this sum, which appears here. Then I have to take the modulus square of this quantity, so the modulus square of this one. This gives me, so what should I erase now? I don't need this anymore. I've used it. Then, so I go on from there. So now this implies that the expected value of the sum over all ij, si minus sj, hi minus hj, square, this is equal to 4d square 1 minus 1 over 2d sum over j neighboring 0 cos pj square. And then when I look at this, I get the sum over ij in the torus, expected value, the expected value which is here. So that's again under L beta. S I L S J L L beta E I P times J minus I. Okay. That's what you get if you take the modulus square. But now again, as we used before, by translation variance, this expected value here, this is S0L, Sj minus I, L, L beta. We are on the torus, so everything is translation invariant. So this is just equal to that, which means that I'm summing over ij a function which only depends on j minus I. So this whole sum here is just equal to the torus times, so one of the sum gives me the torus, and then the other one gives me sum over j in PDL, S0L, SJL, E, I, PJ. Okay, just use translation invariance. So in the end, I get 4d square 1 minus 1 over 2d sum j neighboring 0 cos pj square PD L and sum over j which is exactly the kind of quantity we want, right? 0L SJL EIP times J. Okay. And now I use star star. So star star is telling me that this quantity is smaller than 1 over 2 beta times this quantity. So by star star, this is smaller than star star 1 over 2 beta times, what am I doing here? So I have a 2D. I'm not very happy with something. I will just a second. 1 over 2D, sum over J, neighboring 0, cosine of P times J. Okay. So now let me just have a look. I'm not completely. I think I'm missing something. Just let me just check what I've written. Where is it? Yes, I'm missing something, but where does it come from? Let me see. Oh, sure. Sure, that's okay. So, yes, the thing I've been missing here is I have to sum over I, right? I forgot that. Okay, this alpha bar I, it was just this E minus I P I, which cancel with the contribution which depends on I coming from here, which was this E I P I. So this just disappears, but I still have the sum which gives me a TD. TDN. Okay, that's much better because I want to have this cancel out. So this gives me TDN. Okay, and now it's nice because now I can cancel things. So I have this which is smaller than that. So what does it mean? It means that the quantity I'm interested in, sum over J in the torus, S0L SJL EIPJ. This is smaller than, so now let's cancel what we can. So the 2, they disappear. Then I divide by 1 over 4d squared. Okay, maybe the constant will be off, so we'll see. 1 over 4d beta, I think it's fine, but I think it's okay. Now, when I divide by this, I already have this term here. So when I divide by this square, I just get 1 over this. 1 minus 1 over 2d, sum over j neighboring 0, cosine pj. Minus 1, okay, and the TD, they disappear also. Okay, so I get this, which is almost what I want. What I want is the expected value not of the product of the else component, but the scalar product. But I get the scalar product by just summing over L. Okay, now you sum this over L from 1 to nu of this. This will be smaller than nu over 4d beta 1 minus 1 over 2d sum cosine pj minus 1. And what you get here, if you sum over L, this is just the sum over J TDL of the expected value of S0 scalar product Sj I the scalar product J. Okay, so you get indeed the infrared bound that I was claiming. So it's just computation, very simple computation, so the only thing we use is this differential version of the fact that z is maximized at h equals 0, which gives you this inequality, and then we make a good choice for h. Just choose the simplest possible choice in a sense, because I'm just choosing for hj something which is entirely pointing in one of the directions of the lattice, and then a plane wave as a modulation factor. So this is the simplest possible choice, and this gives me exactly the infrared bound. So that's the end of proof of the infrared bound. And now let me apply this infrared bound. Give you an application of this technique to the fact that there is a long-range order in the ON model in dimension 3 and higher. There are very few known ways of proving such a claim. So that's a very nice tool to have. 10.5 application. It will be long-range order. In the ON model. So let me just state the theorem, and then you'll see that the proof is remarkably simple. 10.4. So let mu L beta be the finite volume Gibbs measure that I introduced at the beginning of the first hour, the one with Hamiltonian beta times the sum over neighbors of the L2 norm square of Si minus Sj. So be a finite volume Gibbs measure on TDL as before, as in this section, but with one additional restriction. So up to now, I was only asking for my spin to take value in R nu, actually in a compact subset of R nu. Now I will fix the subset. I want them to take value in the sphere in R nu, so to have modulus 1. So such that Si, the L2 norm, Si is equal to 1 for all R, almost sure. This one doesn't matter, of course. So I'm assuming that the spins have size 1, length 1. An additional assumption, but which works for the ON model. Actually, it also works for the Potts model. Okay, Potts model have also spin of length 1, but now they are not uniformly distributed over the circle, but just on the vertices of the simplex, the regular simplex. Okay. Then we have the following. Let us define beta 0 as nu over 4d integral on minus pi to power d 1 minus 1 over 2d sum over j neighboring 0 cos pj minus 1 dp. Integrating this quantity. Then the claim is that I will make a comment on beta naught in a second. For any beta larger than beta naught, we have the following. The limit, as the torus size goes to infinity, of the expected value of the L2 norm of the magnetization. So I'm taking 1 over the size of the torus, sum over all j in the torus, Sj square. Right, so that's just, I'm just computing the expected spin in the box, the average spin in the box. I'm taking the norm square of this quantity, and this is larger than 1 minus beta 0 over beta. So when beta is going to infinity, it's going to 1. So you do have long-range order. This is a statement of long-range order, because you have a positive magnetization, actually. Long-range order. The only thing that I'm cheating you about a bit is that, of course, this makes sense. I mean, this is not empty only if beta naught is finite. If beta naught is equal to plus infinity, it does not tell you anything. So let's see when is beta naught finite, so remark. So let's see, the beta naught is this integral. Now the integrand which is here, so it's 1 over this quantity is singular at p equal to 0, because when p equal to 0, the cosine is equal to 1. I get 1 over 2d times 2d times 1. Okay, so I get 1 minus 1, I divide by 0. So I have a singularity. The only singularity I have is at 0. So if I'm integrating over a compact set, so if this is infinity, it's because of this singularity at 0. Right? We have to understand how this is behaving around p equals 0. And the point is that, say, 1 minus 1 over 2d, sum over j neighboring 0, cos pj, this quantity behaves like 1 over 2d times the L2 norm square of p plus small o of the L2 norm square of p. It's just a matter of expanding the cosine. You expand the cosine, you make bounds, you get exactly this. So what does it tell you? Well, so we have a singular, the function we're integrating is behaving like 1 over the norm of p square around 0. When is this integrable? This is integrable if and only if d is strictly greater than 2. Okay? Starts to be summable in d is greater than 2. So this tells you that for all models in dimension 3 and higher, all these models, so the POTS and the ON model, POTS and ON models on ZD exhibit long-range order. At large beta. Okay. In dimension 2, it does not tell you anything because this condition is empty. Beta naught is infinity. You don't have anything. So this result combined with what we saw in the Mermin-Wagner theorem, it shows that the result we get for ON model with n greater or equal to 2 is optimal. We cannot hope to do better because if the result is wrong in dimension 2, there is no long-range order. Right? For POTS and for the Ising model, which is a particular case of this guy also, this is of course not optimal. In dimension 2, you do have a phase transition. We proved it for the Ising model. You proved it in Hugo's class for the POTS model. So there is a phase transition in dimension 2 for these models, but the reason this does not give you something sharp is that you don't have a continuous symmetry in the POTS and the Ising model, so that these tools are not really adapted to prove, to analyze phase transition in these models. Okay? So how do you prove this? So the proof is very, very short, which is kind of nice. So let me do it here. We'll finish on time. It's so short that we'll finish on time, I guess. Maybe I'll start here. Proof of theorem 1024. So we're going to look at the field of all the spins on the torus, Si, and to look at this Fourier transform. So for P, let me put star immediately. Remove 0 immediately. I define S hat P as the Fourier transform of the spins. So it's just the sum. Okay, I will normalize it in a suitable way. Say 1 over square root of the size of the torus, dl, then sum over I in this torus, Si, E, I, P, and I. Okay. It's bad to have all these I's, right? J. Okay, so it's just the Fourier transform of the spins. Some very natural quantity, as I explained before. What we would like to show is that these spins, they are all pointing in the same direction at large beta. So we want to show that their Fourier transform does not have too much mass close to p equals 0, which corresponds to these very long wavelengths. Okay. So that's what we want to do. So that's the notation. Now, observation. Let's say Plancherel. Actually, Parseval is enough here, but Plancherel theorem implies that, well, you know that the Fourier transform preserves the L2 norm. So the sum over all p in t, okay, let me do it. Otherwise, I'm annoyed here. TDL star of S hat p square. Okay. This is equal to the sum over all j in the torus of Sj square. That's just Plancherel, right? The L2 norm is preserved under Fourier transform. Now, what can I say about this guy? So the L2 norm of Sj, there are no expectations here. It's just deterministic statement, right? The L2 norm of Sj is 1, because by assumption, I'm assuming that my spin has always norm 1. So this is equal to 1. So this sum here is just equal to the torus. Right? So the L2 norm of S hat P is just the torus. I mean, of S hat is just the torus. Okay, so now let's turn to what we want to prove. These were just notations. Now I want to control, where is it? Here. I want to control this expectation here. The expectation of the L2 norm square of the average magnetization in the box. So I want to look at this. So let me take 1 over the torus square out, TDL out, and then I have this. So it's the sum over j TDL Sj square L beta. Now, the quantity which is here, let me change color. So the quantity which is here, this is almost the same as S hat of 0. You see, if I take p equals 0, this phase factor disappears. I just get sum over JSJ with this normalization. So I get, with the square, maybe it's better to take it, with the square, this is just equal to, so S, the whole thing here is just equal to TD L times the L2 norm of S hat P square, S hat 0 square. Right? Just take p equals 0, this disappears, and what you get is exactly what is written there. This TD comes from the fact that I have this normalization here. So now this guy simplifies with one of the guys here. So what I get is 1 over TDL, expected value, S hat 0 square. Right? But now, S hat 0 square is equal to what? It's equal to TDL minus the sum over all p different from 0 of S hat p square, because we have this identity. So this is equal to 1 minus 1 over TDL, sum over all p in TDL star minus 0. Now I want it for sure. S hat p square L beta. Right, I've just used this identity. So the sum over all p's of the L2 norm of S hat p square is the torus. So if I want to compute S hat 0 square, is just the torus minus the sum over the remaining p's, which is exactly what is written here. And when I divide by the side of the torus, I get 1 minus 1 over the size of the torus times the sum. Right, so that's not too nasty. And now let's see what we can say about this sum here. Maybe I will do it here. So what is this S hat p square L beta? Right, I need to understand this guy now. It's on the form I want. So that's the quantity I want to control. I get 1 minus something, which is exactly what I want. I want 1 minus something, so I have to control the something. Now I want to show that this is small. This guy is small when beta is large. So let's look at this quantity. Let's write it explicitly. So S hat P is defined here. So I get 1 over the size of the torus. And then I get the sum over I and j in the torus. And then I get the expected value of Si times Sj. And then I get EI P scalar product j minus I. Okay, I just took the definition, put it in. Then, as before, this is translation invariant, so this gives me TD times the sum where I is equal to 0. So the TD disappears, so the only thing that remains is sum over j in TDL. Again, it's translation invariant that I'm using. S0 times Sj L beta E I Pj. Right? We are almost done. Because now this quantity, we know how to, we have a control of it. Because this is exactly, remember that the sum of here is over P, which are different from 0. So for this guy, we have an upper bound by the infrared bound. Okay, this is. So this is smaller by the infrared bound. It's smaller than, it was in nu over 4d beta times 1 minus 1 over 2d sum over j neighboring 0 cos pj minus 1. Right? So now let's just put everything together and check that we have the conclusion we want. So limit L, which goes to infinity of this quantity. This, if we go along here, we see that, so here I have an upper bound, but it's 1 minus, so it's the lower bound. So this is larger than. And what do I get? So 1 minus. And then, so let me again. No, yes, I'm exactly happy. So 1 minus. So the constant first. So the constant is nu over 4d beta, right? And then I have the limit, L which goes to infinity, 1 over the size of the torus, sum over all j in the torus. Okay, now I want this bound, so I will just use it here. 1 minus, okay, let me do it properly. So I have a sum over j which is sum over p. Yeah, okay. Sum over p in TD L star minus 0. So this sum here, and then this quantity is bounded by this. So I have this nu over 4d beta. Okay, it's okay. 1 minus 1 over 2d, sum over the neighbors of 0, cosine of pj to the power minus 1. Right? I just substituted. So it's just the inequality we proved here. I write explicitly. And now why is it over? Well, because you recognize here the Riemann sum for the integral which is in the statement. So this limit is just the integral over minus pi d of 1 minus 1 over 2d sum j neighboring 0 cos pj minus 1 dp. So if now you take this, multiply by nu over 4d, this gives you beta 0. So this is equal to 1 minus beta 0 over beta, which concludes the proof. Okay, so it concludes the proof and it concludes the course. So there will be no lecture next week because I don't have time to start something new. Right? So I will stop here, but you will have 3 hours of exercises next week, where Matan will give you, in principle, another application of the infrared bound to a comparison between models, mean field models, like you did in exercises at the beginning of the semester, and the corresponding model of ZD when D is large. And there is a way to extract information from the mean field model to obtain information on the model on ZD when D is large. And he will explain this during the exercises session next week. Good.